Jetzt hätte ich fast das Wichtigste noch vergessen. Der Grund, warum ihr alle hier seid und ich auch. Als letzter Vortragender des Abends möchte ich Daniel nach vorne bitten, der uns eine Geschichte aus der vorletzten Blank vorträgt, aus der Dokumente-Ausgabe, die auch noch da vorne liegt. Es heißt The Giant? No, you're gonna say it yourself, yeah. Okay. Ja. Das ist nur, um dich wieder spannender zu machen. Also, herzlich willkommen, einen schönen Applaus für Daniel, bitte.
So, ja, wie schon gesagt, stammt der Text aus dieser wunderschönen Dokumente-Ausgabe. Das wollte ich verbrennen, als es dann endlich fertig war, weil es mich so sehr abgenervt hat, diese Ausgabe. Also wir waren mal wieder spät dran, so wie immer, und waren dann bei der Druckerei, haben so nach Kalkulation, die man so vorher so anstellt, wahrscheinlich so 300-400 Euro zu wenig in der Tasche gehabt, sind da hingegangen. Man muss dazu sagen, die Druckerei war schon immer ein bisschen verplant, ja, also die haben auch schon mal gerne irgendwie die Anzeige unseres Hauptsponsors vergessen, was dann heißt, dass irgendwie ein Leistungsausfall besteht von 500 Euro, und dann standen wir da. Und ich kam da hin und er teilte mir dann gleich mit, der Herr, dass diese Druckerei jetzt leider schließt. Dass sie unseren Auftrag aber trotzdem gerne noch machen wollen, weil die schöne Zusammenarbeit und das ganze Geschwafel, bla bla bla. Auf jeden Fall bin ich eine Woche später bereit, die Druckdaten abzugeben, und rufe ihn an und sage, yo, ich bringe heute die Daten vorbei. Und dann sagt er sowas wie, ja, weiß ich jetzt nichts von. Okay, ja, geht es denn trotzdem noch? Ja, schau mal, werden wir schon irgendwie hinkriegen, komm einfach mal rum. Ich bringe also die Daten vorbei, denke so, jo, haben wir es geschafft. So eine Stunde später ruft er mich an und sagt, Herr Krooß, wir haben kein Papier mehr. Ja, gut gelaufen. Also schauen wir uns natürlich nach anderen Druckereien um, was man halt so tun muss. Stellt sich heraus, dass diese besagte Druckerei schon länger ein Dorn im Auge der Kasseler Printmafia war. Es gute Gründe gibt, warum sie pleite gegangen sind, und die anderen lokalen Druckereien verlangten ungefähr 100% Aufschlag auf die Druckkosten, was natürlich irgendwie nicht so leicht zu stemmen ist, wenn man mit so 1200 Euro plant und irgendwie mühselig die Sponsoren in Kassel auch erstmal zusammensucht. Sind wir dann trotzdem noch an einen Printshop geraten, der es irgendwie basteln konnte, wenn auch nicht so perfekt, wie es vorher war, aber ein bisschen den sauren Apfel beißen muss man immer. Sind wir dann hingegangen, waren bereit, auch dort die Druckdaten abzugeben. Und dann kam die Antwort, ja, dankeschön. Der Chef ist jetzt übrigens erstmal in Urlaub. Ja, und? Hat er sich verdient, oder? Ist leider der Einzige, der die Maschine bedienen kann. Ja, wie dem auch sei, letztlich mussten wir dann doch zu Flyer-Alarm gehen. Das war jetzt nicht die inspirierendste Geschichte, aber sie musste mal erzählt werden. Der Text, den ich jetzt vortrage, ist aus einem ganz bestimmten Gefühl entstanden. Ich habe den Film Cinema Paradiso mir nochmal angeschaut. Ist ein ganz wunderbarer italienischer Film, so aus den frühen 2000ern, glaube ich, über den ich gar nicht so viel verraten möchte, aber es ist einfach eine große Liebesgeschichte ans Kino an sich. Und was sind die Dinge, die ich liebe? Unter anderem Literatur, und das ist irgendwie mein Versuch gewesen, etwas zu schreiben, was dem gerecht wird, die Liebe zur Literatur und zum Schreiben an sich. Der Text trägt den Namen A Faceless Giant Beyond the Pines. As the van embarked on its journey, I buried myself deeply into my comic book. Frank Miller's The Dark Knight. Not exactly appropriate for a boy my age. But the good thing about having parents who don't really relate to the things that you care for is they tend is that they tend not to really know much about those things either. "You're reading your stupid comic books again?" my sister asked. I didn't respond. I hated my sister back then, hated her throughout most of my childhood, and would only come to accept her as family when I was already well into my 20s. "How you can read that garbage is beyond me." I rolled my eyes. "Because it's Batman." "Grotesque," she said, laughing. I shook my head. I didn't know what grotesque meant, but I was sure that it was just one of these words my sister had recently picked up somewhere and which she only used to prove her superiority. She was only 3 years older than me, but always acted like she was already an adult. How someone would not want to stay a child for as long as they could was beyond me. To be honest, adulthood didn't seem all that exciting, and no grown-up I'd ever met ever seemed to be too happy about it, even though they got to make all the rules. "Your face is grotesque," I replied. "You don't even know what grotesque means, you little poop face." "Guys, cut it out," my father said firmly from the front seat. We shut our mouths immediately, but behind the pages of my comic I celebrated my little victory with a smile. Both my sister and I knew that our parents needed us to behave, and that now wasn't the time to act childish, though we both weren't quite able to fully understand what exactly was happening. We knew that we were about to live at our grandparents for a while, and we knew that our parents were doing something called the 12-step program. I'd never heard of it, but I thought it sounded kind of cool, like a secret spy training of some sort. Of course, even the imagination of a 9-year-old was not able to mask the fact that my parents would make about the worst spies in the world. My mother is one of the tiniest persons I know, and my father's weight always seemed to expand dramatically whenever he proclaimed that it was time to lose any. I knew that it had to be something bad because during the last days of school, my teachers had only talked to me in those soft, comforting voices that made you know that something was seriously wrong, that it was okay to feel sad. And they used the phrase, "You can always come talk to me," a lot. Frankly, even if I'd had a clue of what I was supposed to feel sad about, I would never have considered talking to any of my teachers, as I preferred not to talk to people more than necessary to begin with. But I did know that voice. It was the same voice I'd heard the year before, when that boy from my school had died of leukemia. They talked to us that way for weeks, and I remember having to go to a funeral of a boy I can't remember ever having shared a single word with. Still, his death shook me to the core. For the next several months, I was terrified of dying whenever I felt even the slightest bit of discomfort. Every sneeze, every headache, or other minor illness felt like definite proof of my impending doom. And I remember lying wide awake in terror many nights, feeling that death was all around me. So I did know that something was up, and I knew that it meant that this was not a time to be a child, but a good boy instead, one that his parents could be proud of. There were very few words spoken after that, but there are only a few childhood memories that have continued to linger as strongly as that 3-hour drive to my grandparents on that particular day, despite the fact that I'd understood so little of what was happening back then, that much of it feels like a blur to me even to this day. I remember that it would soon start to rain heavily, and I can still hear the deep drops pounding like fists on the roof of our bus. I remember finishing my comic and starting to read Gulliver's Travels, a book that sounded like a lot of fun in theory, but which I found frustratingly difficult to read. I remember my mother shouting and the bus coming to an abrupt halt, her begging to get out, yelling, "I can't do it," over and over again. I remember us continuing to drive on for what felt like hours later, me in complete terror, holding my book to my chest like a Bible and listening to my mother sobbing. I'd never seen my mother in tears, and the idea that grown-ups were even allowed to cry had never occurred to me before. But I knew back then, as I know today, that bus ride was the moment that changed everything. When we arrived at our grandparents', it was already long past midnight. I'd never really liked staying there, as the house always felt somewhat haunted to me. Even when I was a grown man, I still always preferred to keep the light on whenever I went to sleep there. As we entered the living room, the distinctive smell of strong coffee welcomed us, as it always did, My grandpa sitting in his white ripped undershirt at the kitchen table with a grim face, a cup of coffee in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Apart from his wedding picture, I don't think a single photograph exists of my grandpa in anything other than his white ripped undershirt holding a cup of coffee. And I remember only few occasions when I saw my grandpa smile. I still loved him very much, perhaps exactly because of the distance that he kept to people. He was a sort of man who would disappear for hours without saying a word and come back from his workshop with something he had handcrafted entirely for you. He would put it on the table in front of you, awkwardly tousling your hair, and then he would simply go back to drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes again. There's something profoundly beautiful of being able to share silence with someone in comfort. And whenever I spent time alone with my grandpa, I felt an unspoken bond that was only for the two of us to understand. A pottery T-Rex still stands on the top of my bookshelf today. My grandma was the complete opposite, a woman whose seemingly endless energy seemed completely out of place for a person of her tiny proportions. She could go on talking for hours on end, and to be honest, sometimes I wished I'd had the guts to just tell her to shut her mouth already. My interest in reading simply did not go well with her interest to fill the void of a silent room. I didn't quite understand the dynamics of my grandparents' relationship back then, and I still continue to be baffled about it. Over the years, I've come to understand that, like most people of their generation, they must have been heavily traumatized by the war. But that was never spoken of, and I can only guess at what brought these two together and kept them a couple until my grandpa's passing. As we sat down, I glanced tiredly into my grandpa's eyes as the adult started talking. He smiled at me, and again, I got the feeling that something must be seriously wrong. I must have fallen asleep then, because the next thing I remember is my grandma waking me up the next morning, telling me to come down to say goodbye. The odd stiffness I felt in my gut that morning would not quite leave me in the days to come. My parents did genuinely not seem like themselves, but I still couldn't put my finger on what was wrong. I suspect now that it might have been the first day I ever witnessed my parents sober. My father held me in the doorstep, and I clung around his waist, not wanting to let him go. "We'll be fine," he said. "We're doing this for you, you know. It will all be over soon, I promise. And I bet in the meantime you'll even make some good friends here." I was really still just a little boy back then, and it would take several more years to dawn on me that my parents were indeed completely insane. But I knew back then, and I can only assume that so did my father, that that statement was completely absurd. No one had come to my 9th birthday party, but I still remember that it had been a great day. I received a complete book set of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, including The Hobbit, which I was to devour several times in the years to come. I wasn't particularly good at making friends, and the characters I met within the safe boundaries of a novel were all the company I ever wished for. But in that very moment, I would for the first time in my life learn the true meaning of what it meant to be lonely. Because after my father let go of my hand, my parents were gone, and I was not to see them for months. With that hollow feeling of not having your parents around to protect you, my grandparents' house frightened me more than it had ever done before. The 3-floored house felt huge to me and depressingly dark. Each floor and each room seemed to possess its own kind of darkness, its own distinguished rotten smell, and I always felt lost. Even though I was given a room in the attic, one of the few rooms in the building that actually seemed to receive a bit of daylight, I preferred to spend as little time in it as possible, as it smelled of dust and cold smoke that hurt my eyes and nose. Although 10 children had once grown up in that house, there was so little about it that reminded one of life. There was a sadness that lay upon that place, and the walls seemed to hide stories that no one had any intentions of retelling. It seems strange now that a boy so in love with reading about adventures was so deeply afraid of uncovering the mysteries this place beheld. There always seemed to be some comfort within the covers of a book, as whenever something felt too frightening, the covers could simply be shut. But this felt very real, and in this reality, I was simply not a brave boy. I would spend the next couple of days mostly in the garden, which was small, but felt kind of wild too. At its center stood an old apple tree whose fruit smelled foul, and even though my grandma always claimed that they were perfectly edible, they tasted nothing like the apples we used to buy back home in the supermarket. When I finished my struggle through Gulliver's Travels, I began one of my countless rereads of Peter Pan. It was just one of these books. Up to this day, I'm still amazed how at times 5 minutes suffice to get into a novel that has the potential to stay with you through the rest of your life. All romance aside, I've never had that experience with a human being, and I doubt I ever will. Still, it felt urgent to get some new reading material as soon as I possibly could, and I knew that it was time to convince my grandpa to take me to the library. Please, don't you have to get some groceries anyways? I mean, we're short of ice cream. The library's in the city, isn't it? You could just leave me there and pick me up afterwards. Can't it wait until tomorrow? No, I yelled, grabbing his arm and failing in the attempt to lift him from his chair. Come on, you can smoke as much as you want on your way. I won't tell Grandma, I promise. And surely, the first thing my grandpa did when we stepped outside was light a cigarette. It was a cloudy but hot summer day, and little sprinkles of warm rain touched our skin as we slowly walked around into town in silence. I've learned to appreciate that there's something idyllic about the small rural town of my grandparents, but as a boy it frustrated me deeply simply because there was so little to do. I was used to the big city life, and the surreal tranquility that seemed to inhabit the town made me feel very uncomfortable. At the center stood a church that felt unproportionately large for a town of that size, and the shadow that it cast upon the city center seemed to oppress everything it enveloped. I always held my breath when I went past it, as it felt like the little marbles of its walls watched my every step. All right then, my grandpa said as we stood in front of the library, handing me his card. You take your time in there. I think I'll just wait outside. I smiled. In the meantime, I'll try to make some sense of this, he said, holding up my copy of The Dark Knight. You're holding it upside down, I said. I probably would have figured that out at some point, he said, cracking up over his own joke. Thank you, I said and hugged him. He tousled my hair. All right now, off you go. Even though there were so many places that I feared and avoided as a child, I could never find a single flaw with any library. I don't think I ever felt more self-confident than within the walls of those magical buildings. I loved their silence and the unique smell of old books that made me feel like home. And I loved losing myself within the large bookshelves, like an adventurer hunting for unknown treasures. I grabbed as many books as my tiny arms could carry, choosing some because of their intriguing titles and others because the color of the jacket appealed to me. I sat down at the large table in the empty room with a broad smile on my face. As I looked at the pile, which I had neatly organized by size, it suddenly struck me that I was a very weird boy, and the strange numbness in my gut that I had felt when my parents left a few days ago seemed to grow into something unbearably painful. I wondered if I'd ever meet a friend that would share my passions, and that I would actually want to talk to. And I was suddenly deeply afraid that I would never see my parents again. When I noticed the first tear dropping on the dusty cover of the book in front of me, I knew it was too late to shake it off. Within an instant, I had started crying, and in that very moment, I realized just how lonely I really felt. You know, acceptance is the first step, the soft voice of a girl whispered into my ear. Startled, I jumped off my chair, swiping the books from the table and clumsily crashing into the nearest bookshelf. As I looked up, I saw a pale, black-haired girl in a white dress, laughing at my mishap. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to frighten you. I took a deep breath and washed away the tears from my eyes. You really don't have to hide them, though, you know? Still shaking, I got to my feet. Acceptance of what? I asked. She smiled. Acceptance of feeling alone. I gulped. Come on, let's get you some cocoa. Without even thinking about it, I followed her down the hall. She grabbed a few books off the shelves in passing and finally stopped at the bookshelf located at the very back end of the library, placing them in a pile in front of it. "What are you doing?" I asked. "What do you think I'm doing, klutz? I'm paying our travel fare." Confused, I turned to face her. "But," I started. Suddenly, the room started shaking. Books began to whirl through the air. Before I could even stop to think about what was happening, we were already gone. My heart was pounding. Oops. Sorry. My heart was pounding heavily in my chest as we crash-landed in the field behind the library. "How did you do that?" She chuckled. "I've learned a few tricks over the years." I looked skeptically into her freckled face. She couldn't be much older than me. "How old are you exactly?" "I'm 11. "And how long have you been doing magic?" She smiled. "Now, that's an entirely different question, isn't it?" "I guess so," I said, unsure of what she meant by it. "Ah," she said, "don't you just love a full moon night?" Confused, I looked around and for the first time noticed that the stars were already shining brightly in the sky. "My grandpa!" I yelled out, suddenly aware that he must still be waiting for me outside. "What about him?" "He's waiting for me. He must be sick with worry." "Don't worry about it," she said. "Time runs a bit differently around here." "How can you say that? Time works the same for everyone." "Do you really believe that?" I shrugged. "I thought so," she winked. "Are you coming or what?" Before I could start arguing again, she was already leading the way. As we went along the library, I noticed that my grandpa was not standing in front of it, but I did not have the chance to ask about it, as the girl walked in great strides towards the city, and I had a hard time keeping up. Even though everything seemed to stand exactly where it was supposed to stand, the city felt very different somehow, looking sharper and more colorful. I'd never been to the city by night and was surprised to see that the streets were crowded with people. Only they seemed somehow odd and not quite like anyone I had ever seen before. I saw a woman with a nose so large and broad it always touched her breasts, a neatly dressed bearded man the size of a small dog standing beside her, holding her hand and laughing from his belly, with a deep, vibrating voice. I saw Siamese twins with heads that seemed so large that they were about to pop out of their body and fly into the distant sky. I saw a crowd so cheerful, whose weird appearance did not scare me, but lifted my timid spirit. The girl grabbed my hand, and as we continued walking, I almost felt like I was floating through the masses. The odd smells of food and drinks I had never seen before, making me dizzy, but also somehow feel at home. We stepped into a small house right next to the place where Grandpa used to buy his cigarettes, and as the girl closed the door, the noise outside was immediately muted. "Eve? Is that you?" A high-pitched woman's voice came from the hallway. "Yes," the girl yelled back, "and I've brought company." A woman in a nightgown with a silver-gray perm and the biggest behind I had ever seen came rushing into the hallway, an old donkey with a smoking pipe in his mouth trailing behind her. "Oh," she said cheerfully, "who do we have here?" I stood in silence, my mouth wide open. "This is the moment where you introduce yourself," Eve said closely into my ears. I shook myself. "Adam," I said shyly. "Adam and Eve! Isn't that cute, honey?" The donkey shrugged his shoulders and went back to where he had come from. "Don't you think so?" she asked again, this time apparently addressing us. Eve rolled her eyes. "Granny," I shook my head. "I don't know. I don't like stories from the Bible. They always scare me and don't make much sense to me." "Stories from the what?" "The Bible?" The woman shrugged, then shook her head. "Never heard of it," she said, and clapped her hands. "Anyways, who wants cocoa?" When the strange woman placed the cup of hot chocolate in front of me, I thanked her with a coy nod. "Have you been crying?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded, feeling caught. Poor kid, she said. Take a sip. It will make you feel better. I did as I was told. It tasted nothing like any hot chocolate I've ever had before. The texture was thick, almost like pudding, the spices of cinnamon, nuts, and ginger tickling my tongue, followed by a finish so chocolatey and sweet that I almost couldn't handle the feelings of joy rushing through my veins. Feeling better? Yes, I said, smiling. Thank you. A one-eyed boy about my age, with large furry pointy ears, came into the kitchen, wearing a huge monocle, a feathery top hat, and a mustache that looked fake, even though with that odd combination of people sitting at the table, it seemed entirely plausible that a 9-year-old could grow a mustache in this strange place. Who the hell is this? He asked harshly. Where are your manners, young man? The grandmother said, hitting her nephew on the head with a newspaper. Is that any way to introduce yourself? All right, he said, rubbing his head. Sorry. He held out his hand. Call me Ishmael. Hesitantly, I shook his hand. I'm Adam. He's a new friend of mine, Eve said cheerfully. My heart skipped a beat. Was it really that easy to make a friend? It seemed a bit rushed, to say the least. But I did like Eve, even though I couldn't quite tell why. So what brings you here? I have a feeling that you don't actually belong here. Because he's sad, Eve answered for me. He needs an adventure. Yes, the grandmother said excitedly. A good adventure always helps to mend a broken soul. Ishmael rolled his eye. Are you talking about that stupid treasure nonsense again? He might be the missing piece, Eve said. What treasure? I asked, uncomfortably moving on my chair in the crossfire. The one that's guarded by the faceless giant and hidden in a cave beyond the pines, Eve said. The faceless giant? I asked. Yes, Ishmael yelled out. How can you not have heard of him? Everyone knows that story. I decided then and there that I did not care much for Ishmael. He seemed cocky and rude. Glancing a bit lost into my cock, I mumbled, That sounds dangerous. Grinning, Eve tucked her grandma's arm in excitement. Can we keep him? Her granny looked at her skeptically. You know the rules. Obviously not satisfied with that response, Eve sighed. I blushed. It's a stupid fairy tale for children, Ishmael said, annoyed, about a stupid giant hiding in a stupid cave. Who's he hiding from? I asked curiously. Himself, mainly. I did not understand a word of what was said, and my eyes started to wander, looking around the weirdly cozy room. Little floating lanterns of all sizes and colors casting little shadows on the walls that seemed to tell all sorts of stories. I didn't know why I was and why I was there, but I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And I noticed that, for the first time in days, the weird numbness in my gut was gone, replaced by a feeling of comfort and warmth I'd never really felt before. Without even thinking about my words, I felt my lips move. I'm up for an adventure, I said. Danke fürs Zuhören.